In August of 1973, a man by the name of Jan Erik Olsson walked into a bank in Sweden. And he was looking to do more than just take out a deposit or a withdrawal or make a deposit. Olsson had been on what they consider to be furlough from prison in Sweden. It's a weird system that they have over in Sweden jails, where if you're having a longer visit in prison, they let you go on furlough in the middle of it because they don't want you to go completely insane in jail. So they give you a break from prison life, and then you're supposed to go back on agreed upon date and time to complete your sentence. Olsson decided that that was a bad deal. So instead, he decides to go into this bank to rob it. What was supposed to be, in his perspective, an easy job turned into a complete and utter mess. The second one of the bank tellers tripped the silent alarm. What ends up happening in this story is it turns into a 6-day hostage situation where Olsson is stuck in this bank with the bank tellers, and he's holding them hostage, and he gives these demands to the police outside. He really only asks for a few things. One, a ton of money, which they immediately give him, but then he notices they're all in big bills and clearly easy to trace. So he goes and asks for a bunch of small bills that are crumpled up and old so that he can get away with his money. They comply to that. He asks for a getaway car, which again they comply with. He asks that one of his good friends who's currently in prison be released and given to him to join him in the bank heist. And the amazing thing is they also give him that request, which is kind of insane. And for the last thing, he wants to be let go with the hostages in the car with him. That's the one thing the cops say no to. They will not let him take the hostages on a joyride. So the hostage situation is on. After a few days, the cops find a way to trap them in the vault where they're able to drill holes in the ceiling so they can watch and get a lay of the land. And what they find when they're watching this situation in this bank vault is absolutely crazy. You would imagine being held hostage that it would be a very trying and difficult time. Like no one here would really enjoy being held hostage. But what they observed is that not only were everyone laughing and smiling in the bank vault, including the hostages, but they were dancing and listening to the radio, and it looked like they were having a good time. When it was time for them to intervene, they were going to lay gas down into the bank vault. The hostages came to the defense of the bank robbers. They formed a barrier so that they couldn't get in, and they prevented the cops from intervening to let them free. Eventually, things did their proper course. The police got in. Olsson and his comrade were both arrested and put back in jail. And that's where things get even weirder because the police would not get any cooperation from the hostages. Actually, what they found is that these hostages raised money to pay for the defense of the bank robber captor. Now, we know of this whole thing as the very first case of what we call Stockholm Syndrome. This is where that phrase came from because this bank was in Stockholm, and it's become known as this psychological thing that can happen in hostage-type situations where there's an empathetic response to the captor where they can almost resonate with and feel empathy for their situation, and there's almost this eagerness to please as a result. This is where that phrase comes from, when people are held captive and end up empathetic towards their captors. It's a really remarkable situation. I encourage you to read more because I really was very brief with it because it's a really remarkable story. This morning we're continuing our series For the One. Over the course of this series, we're looking at the various ways that Jesus seeks out the lost. In Luke chapter 15, we find 3 parables from Jesus where Jesus talks about the length God would be willing to go for the lost and hurting in the world. Whether it be the lost sheep that gets lost, so the shepherd leaves the 99 in search for him, or the woman who tosses her entire house to find one small coin, or the father who loses his son and just pines for him and runs to meet him, and he finally begins his journey home. These are parables that many of us know really well. So instead of looking at the parables themselves, what we've been doing throughout this series is we've been looking at the way Jesus lives out these teachings, those times where he puts his money where his mouth is and actually does what he preaches. And so far, we've looked at two different stories from the life of Jesus. We've looked at the way Jesus goes for the outcasts and how he reaches somebody like a tax collector. Last week, we talked about how Jesus has a heart for the hopeless, those that feel like there's no way out and they're just stuck in this place that they're trapped in. This morning, I want to continue the series and look at the way Jesus has a heart for the captives. If you have a Bible, you can open that up to Mark chapter 5. Mark chapter 5. If you're following along, week 1 we were in Luke chapter 5. Last week we were in John chapter 5. Now we're in Mark chapter 5. That was purely accidental. That was not done on purpose, but it's a fun little coincidence. In Mark chapter 5, we find Jesus crossing the Sea of Galilee right at the end of chapter 4. So the context of all of this, Jesus is not in Israel territory anymore. He's in what we would consider to be pagan, Gentile territory. He is as far from home as we find him in the Gospels, essentially. He is no longer surrounded by Jews. So that's an important thing for us to keep in mind as we read this passage. We're going to read the first 5 verses to start, and then we're going to talk about it, so keep this open. Mark chapter 5, verse 1. So they arrived at the other side of the lake in the region of the Gerasenes. When Jesus climbed out of the boat, a man possessed by an evil spirit came out of the tombs to meet him. This man lived in the burial caves and could no longer be restrained, even with a chain. Whenever he was put into chains and shackles, as he often was, he snapped the chains from his wrists and smashed the shackles. No one was strong enough to subdue him. Day and night he wandered among the burial caves in the hills, howling and cutting himself with sharp stones. Let's go ahead and pause there and take a look at what is happening here at the beginning of chapter 5. Right off the bat, Mark sets a tone here, and it's not a very happy and light tone. This is a very bleak and dark passage. If you were to look at it from the Jewish perspective, this passage is just filled with Jewish no-nos. The contamination that's in this passage is ridiculous. One thing you need to know about the Jewish worship system, sacrificial system, is they were extremely high on what they would consider to be like ritual cleanliness. Like they had to have things in order to partake in worship. And there were a lot of things that a good Jew would avoid at all costs. And this passage is full of it. I mean, when you think about this passage, it's radioactive with things that Jews should have nothing to do with. You have Jesus in Gentile territory. That's a big no-no. You have Jesus surrounded by unclean people, the Gentiles, one of which is demon-possessed, not high up on the cleanliness list of the Jewish system. He's also living amongst the dead, which, again, is for the Jews a huge no-no. You weren't allowed to touch or be around dead bodies. It made you sacrificially unclean. And not only that, but you were not allowed to touch blood. Bleeding was a big no-no as well. And now you've got this demon-possessed man, and he's bleeding all over the place. If you were a good, devout Jew reading this passage, I would imagine there would be audible gasps in the room. This is not a place where a good Jewish person should be. I almost envision a situation where the most pious of Jews would want to be like go and give a sacrifice after hearing this just to cleanse themselves, like washing their ears out because they just heard something so utterly unclean. That's the backdrop here. So when you think about it in the terms of Jesus being the Son of God, crossing over the river or the lake to be here, it is absolutely insane. This is not the type of place that the Son of God belongs. And yet, Jesus not only finds himself there, but he went out of his way to cross over the lake, the Sea of Galilee, to be there. He singles out this one specific situation because at the very end, spoiler alert, Jesus essentially does some stuff here, gets right back in the boat, and then goes back home again. Like, this is something he has made a destination point in his ministry. This would be kind of like a pastor going and setting up shop in the lobby of a porn store or the satanic church. You don't do that. Like, that is not something many people would be okay with, but yet that's what Jesus is doing here. Now, before we look at the way Jesus engages with this situation, I want to ask the question of who is this demon-possessed man? Who is it that Jesus ends up interacting with while he is over in this region? We don't know a whole lot about his backstory. We don't know who he was. We don't know what he did for a living. We don't know whether he was married, whether he had kids. We don't know any of those things. Mark doesn't seem too preoccupied with that information. What Mark seems preoccupied with is not who he was, but who he is in this moment that Jesus interacts with him. And what we find is this man living away from community, stuck in the middle of a graveyard by choice, and he is just absolutely deranged. He's unable to be restrained, and he just howls, and he hurts himself, and he is just living a really bad situation. But the thing I want you to see right here at the beginning is that this is not the type of place somebody would choose to end up on their own free will. Like, nobody wakes up as a kid and says, you know what, when I get older, I want to be that crazy guy in the graveyard. I want to be that scary guy that nobody wants to talk to. I want all the demons, and I want to have this reputation. I want to live amongst the dead and the rotting. Because you need to remember, this is before we have like the embalming process. Like, this place would stink. This would not be a pleasant place to live. Nobody wakes up and says, that's my future, and I'm so excited for it to come. When we look at this man, I think it's really important for us to look through this lens of this is a man whose dreams and hopes were robbed from him. His sense of self has been robbed from him. It has been taken from him. Now, we could go into a whole discussion about he probably did something to deserve this, and whatever. Nobody wants this for their life. This is not what he set out for. His family, his job, his sense of self, his sense of identity, all of these things have been taken from him against his will, one way or another. This is something that has happened to his life. Now, very few of us can probably say, maybe some of us would be willing to say, you know, I've seen a demon-possessed person. Like, I'm not naive enough to say this doesn't happen, but I will say it's rather rare. Like, many of us, most of us can probably live our whole lives and not experience anything close to what Jesus is experiencing here. Like, has anyone here ever found a dead or a crazy person who was unable to be restrained, just running around the graveyard, living there? Like, that's not something we encounter a whole lot. But what I want us to see as we begin this journey together this morning is that we all know what it's like to be held captive by something. This man is being held captive by these evil spirits. We all can resonate, either because we have been or we currently are held captive by some aspect in our lives that robs us of our sense of self, that robs us of our sense of identity, that robs us of these relationships or these job situations, that robs us of these things that we dreamed for. We've all encountered things like severe mental illness, where through something that has happened biologically within our brains, we no longer know who we are or who we were, and we miss what was. But we find ourselves captive to this disease. We've all seen or experienced abusive relationships Where before this relationship, we were one way, and now because of this relationship, we have a hard time knowing who we are, and it's ruined these relationships, and it's ruined our sense of self. We've experienced this, or we know somebody who has. We've all seen or experienced different addictions, whether it be substance addictions or addictions to other things like pornography or spending money. We've all seen the way that can rob us of our sense of self. I was happier when I didn't drink all the time. I was happier when I wasn't abusing these other substances. I was happier when I wasn't trapped and held captive to these things that I just want out of my life. But for some reason, because of just the way I'm wired in this moment, I have a hard time moving past them. We've all seen what it's like to be held captive by soul-crushing debt, whether it be through student loans or just abuse of credit card debt, where we have a hard time making ends meet and we just feel so trapped. We work and we work and we work, and all of our money just seems to disappear before it even enters our bank accounts. We've all seen what it feels like to be held captive to sin. These things in our lives that we know are bad for us. We know we need to knock it off, but every time we try, every time we feel like we're making momentum, we just feel so trapped. And it feels so completely helpless. When we are kids, none of us dream of these things. Nobody dreams about being in an abusive relationship. Nobody dreams about being addicted to substances or alcohol. Nobody dreams of being in debt. Nobody dreams of being trapped in sin. Nobody dreams of these things, and yet it happens, and it is such a part of so many of our stories. We know what it's like to be held captive. And listen, I'm not saying that all of these things that I listed are necessarily demonic in nature. I live by this basic idea that there's a spiritual realm to all things. Everything is spiritual in some way, but not everything is always spiritual. Like there's other things at play in a lot of these situations. But we know this basic concept of captivity. We've been held captive. We've had our futures changed by things outside of our control. We've had our dreams robbed of us. We've had our sense of identity robbed from us. Many of us understand what this man is experiencing, even though we are living in a different time and experiencing it in different ways. So now that we've taken a look at the man Jesus encounters, let's go ahead and continue reading and read verses 6 through Let's do 6 through 20, and let's see the way Jesus interacts with him. Verse 6. When Jesus was still some distance away, if you've got a pencil, I want you to underline that part, because that's very significant. We're going to come back to this in a moment. When Jesus was still some distance away, the man saw him, ran to meet him, and bowed low before him. With a shriek, he screamed, "Why are you interfering with me, Jesus, Son of the Most High God?" If you've got a pencil, you can underline Son of the Most High God. We're not going to talk about that, but it's significant. "In the name of God, I beg you, don't torture me." For Jesus had already said to the spirit, "Come out of the man, you evil spirit." Then Jesus demanded, "What is your name?" And he replied, "My name is Legion, because there are many of us inside this man." Then the evil spirits begged him again and again not to send them to some distant place. There happened to be a large herd of pigs feeding in the hillside nearby. "Send us into those pigs," the spirits begged. "Let us enter them." So Jesus gave them permission. The evil spirits came out of the man and entered the pigs, and the entire herd of about 2,000 pigs plunged down the steep hillside into the lake and drowned in the water. The herdsmen fled to the nearby town and the surrounding countryside, spreading the news as they ran. People rushed out to see what had happened. The crowd soon gathered around Jesus, and they saw the man who had been possessed by the legion of demons. He was sitting there, fully clothed and perfectly sane. And they were all afraid. Then those who had seen what happened told the others about the demon-possessed man and the pigs, and the crowd began pleading with Jesus to go away and leave them alone. As Jesus was getting into the boat, the man who had been demon-possessed begged to go with him. But Jesus said, "No. Go home to your family and tell them everything the Lord has done for you and how merciful he has been." So the man started off to visit the 10 towns of that region and began to proclaim the great things Jesus had done for him. And everyone was amazed at what he told them. Jesus encounters this man who is held captive. And Jesus frees the captive and gives him life. There is so much in this passage that we don't have time for. This is one of my favorite passages in the Gospel of Mark. I love this passage. There's so much that we could say that we don't have time to say. Like the way the demon responds or addresses Jesus, or the way the townspeople respond to this miraculous thing, or the fact that the pigs are involved. Like there's so much to talk about that we don't have time to talk about. But one thing I really want to point out as we begin to process through this encounter is the way this whole thing starts. Nowhere in this passage does this man ask Jesus for help. What you actually see here is Jesus is already throwing haymakers the second he gets off the boat. As this man is running to Jesus, Jesus is already telling this demon what to do. He's already, before this whole thing even happens, he's yelling at this demon. You can look at it yourself in verse 8. "Come out of this man, you evil spirit." He's already beginning to address the problem. And I have to wonder as I read through this, does this man want to be freed? And you might think that sounds crazy. Like he's demon-possessed. He doesn't want to be there. We already laid this foundation that he's held captive, and this isn't the dreams he had for himself, that he's lost his sense of self in his relationship. We've already laid that foundation. What do you mean? Do you wonder if he wanted this? That's how addictions and being held captive sometimes works. Not all the time. I'm not trying to oversimplify a complicated thing, but I often wonder if we often don't have a little bit of Stockholm syndrome ourselves when it comes to the things that hold us captive. Think about it from this angle. This man, this is life that he knows. If the demons go away, he's all of a sudden stuck in a life that he doesn't understand anymore. Will he be welcomed back home? Will his family bring him back in? Will he be able to find work? Right now, people are taking care of him. They're coming and they're trying to contain him because they need to feed him. They're trying to do right by this man. If that all goes away, who is he now? Can he live with the things that he's done and experienced? There's comfort sometimes in understanding life as is. We see this all the time when it comes to abusive situations, like why don't they just leave? We've all said that before from the outside. There's comfort in knowing what is, and there's fear of knowing what could happen if that ever takes place. If you have a drinking problem, why don't you just stop the drinking? Why don't you just stop abusing substances? Because there's comfort in the knowing. And there's a lot of psychological stuff involved with that too. Like I said, it's a very complicated thing, but we get trapped in these systems. When it comes to debt, why do we just stop spending money? You can't. It's something we just get so used to. Why don't you just stop sinning? Why don't you just stop looking at those things and doing these things and saying those things? There's comfort in the knowing. Sometimes when we are held captive, we end up with Stockholm syndrome. We end up stuck, not sure if we'll ever be free. But what I find here, when you look at this story, is that Jesus shows us that there is life beyond captivity. This man's identity is not just the demon-possessed man. There is life beyond what happens here. I mean, just look at the way this story ends. It's kind of remarkable. Jesus frees this man, gives him life, frees him from captivity, sets him free, and the man just wants to continue on with Jesus. He wants to cross over the lake and continue to live with Jesus, which makes sense. I mean, if you look at some of the other things we've looked at this series, this is something Jesus has asked people to do throughout his ministry. Hey, Matthew, you were a tax collector. Leave that, come follow me. Yet, that's not the way this man's story ends. When he asked to go with Jesus, this man is turned down. What's he told to do instead? Go home. Enjoy your freedom and share what has been done for you. Jesus says your identity is no longer that of a demon-possessed man. Your identity now is one that I have personally given to you. You are now the first missionary in this Gentile land. That's your legacy. That's who you are. You are not what you were. You are something new. That's what Jesus does for those in captivity. He frees them, he gives them a new identity, and he sends them on a new mission with a new purpose. He changes their life. This man is unrecognizable at the end of this passage. If you are here this morning and you are experiencing some level of captivity, whether it be through substance abuse, whether it be from abusive relationships, whether it be from debt or sin or any plethora of things that when you look at your life, you think to yourself, this isn't where I want to be. This isn't how I envision my life ending up, and yet I'm here. And I don't know how I will ever be free. What I want you to know is that these experiences that you are living do not define your future. Your identity is not wrapped up in the things that hold you captive. Your identity is wrapped up in the things that Jesus calls you to be. Jesus wants to set you free and give you that new identity. Now, I've already said that there's a spiritual component and there's also a real life component. It's not helpful for me to sit up here and say you just need to pray it away. You're addicted? Well, just pray harder. Like, that doesn't get you all the way. It's a start. It's the foundation. It's a pivotal part of this experience. But there also are resources that we have access to in this amazing city we live in that can help you with whatever captivity you might be experiencing. So if you have substance abuse problems, we can find you help. If you have abusive relationship situations and you're not sure how to leave those relationships, we can find you some resources that can help. If you find yourself addicted to other things, or if you find yourself in debt, there are some things we can do to help. There's actually going to be a thing here in Wyoming here not too long from now that will be a class to help with the debt stuff. I can send you some information on that. I just got an email about it yesterday. There are resources to help, and we are here to connect you to resources. We want to walk with you through this because that's what Jesus has called us to do. But it's important that you understand that you do not need to live in captivity. There is freedom available to you through the blood and sacrifice of Jesus. He wants to make you whole, and he wants to deliver you from captivity. So if you find yourself in that stage of life, come and talk to me after the service. We would love to connect you to those resources. Here in a moment, the praise team's going to come up. Throughout this series, we've been interacting with these racks up front. And we've been asking you each and every week to think about your own life. We all know people, even if it's not us, right? Like so far we've talked about being an outcast. Even if you're not an outcast, chances are you know an outcast. Somebody who feels shunned from the church, who feels like they're not welcome here. Last week, hopelessness. We all, if we are not hopeless ourselves, we know someone in our lives who might be hopeless. We've asked you to come up and write their first name on a note card and clip them to these racks and to be praying over these names throughout the week. That is our mission. God has called us to make an impact in these lives. You can use those invite cards, but these people, these racks won't be up here at the start of the next series because that'd be awkward and weird. What I want to invite you to do now is we respond in worship. Think for a moment. Pray. and ask God to bring somebody's name to your life who feels like they're captive, that they're stuck, that they're where they're not supposed to be and they don't know how to get out of that because there's something that just seems to be binding them to that station in life. And if there's somebody in your life, a real life person, that you personally know, this isn't some ambiguous thing that we can't actually handle. Like this is people in our own lives, our own walks. I want you to come on up. There are 2 stations. Just write their first name and find any spot on these racks that you can find a spot and just clip their names there. And we will be praying for these people throughout the week. So that's what I'm going to ask you to do here in a moment. Why don't we go ahead and pray, and then the worship team can come up and lead us in worship as we respond to the God who delivers captives and sets them free. Lord, we thank you. We thank you for your goodness. We thank you for your mercy. We thank you for setting us free and giving us purpose and a mission to reach people in our lives, to share what has been done for us. This gift of grace that we would be helpless to ever accomplish on our own. We are so beyond grateful for that. If there are people here this morning or watching from home or from wherever it is that they find themselves, if they find themselves stuck in captivity, we pray that we can come alongside them, that we can show them the freedom found in Jesus, that we can provide them the resources they need to be made whole. We ask that you reveal to them this gift of grace that was paid by your crucifixion, that sets us free, that provides us with this life. Help us to see these things in our lives. Lord, for those of us that know people stuck in captivity, I ask that you give us the boldness that we need to interact with them and show them this better way, this new way of life. Empower us to join you in your mission, your ministry. Lord, it's your name that we pray. Amen.